Good afternoon and good morning across Canada. We have a few time zones at play here. We want to welcome you all. I'm Rabbi Dan Moskovitz from Temple Sholom in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And you'll be seeing more of me in a moment as I'll act as the moderator and the interviewer for my friend and our rabbi and a member of Knesset, Gilad Kariv. Before I introduce Lee Weisser of Arts of Canada and David Burson of Amenu Canada, just wanted to give a couple of quick sort of Zoom instructions. So this is a webinar, so we can't see your camera. You don't have to, fix your hair or whatever it is. If you have a question that you'd like to submit and you didn't submit it in advance, at this point, we'd like you to use the Q&A function, which is down in the menu bar at the bottom of the screen. No need to raise your hand. I know some of you have already clicked that. But if you have a question, just submit it through the Q&A chat and we will use it that way. And we'll be collating through those questions and hopefully we'll get to everything or at least something representative of that. Two other things to mention: this webinar is being recorded and it'll be available afterwards. You'll get a follow-up email from us. And lastly, we've turned on live transcription. So if you would like to have subtitles beneath, doesn't do a great job with Hebrew, but if you'd like to have subtitles for those that would benefit from them, you can click on live transcription again in the lower menu bar, and that should turn on subtitles on your screen. If you have any questions or problems, I guess you can email to zoom@templeshalom.ca, which was the email that your reminder came from, and we'll try to triage those as they come in, since we've turned off the chat so as not to be distracted by that. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lee Weisser from Arts of Canada.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Rabbi. I'm Lee Weisser. I'm honored to be the president of Arts of Canada, the Zionist voice of the Reform Jewish community of Canada. And Arts of Canada is partnering with Amenu Canada to host today's conversation with MK Rabbi Gilad Kariv. Our goal is to bring you, our members and friends, closer to the current political situation in Israel. And we are delighted to have almost 200 people tuning in from coast to coast. This is an exciting time for progressive Zionists. Today, you will learn what our Israeli colleagues are fighting for, their successes and challenges. You will learn how important it is for we as progressive Zionists in the diaspora to promote our shared values in the world Zionist and Canadian Zionist movements. We've actively sought out your questions so that we can have a genuine dialogue and help you feel connected to what is happening right now in the Knesset. I hope you enjoy this opportunity. It's been a pleasure to work with a wonderful team on this project. I want to thank Penny Fine, Casey Sower, and Rabbi Dan Moskovitz, and particularly David Burson, president of Amenu Canada, for initiating this partnership. David, over to you.
Good morning from Vancouver. Thank you, Penny, and I'm very honored to be here together with you. Before we proceed, I'd just like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the ancestral homelands of Indigenous people across Canada, caretakers and stewards of this land for time immemorial, each with their own unique traditions, languages, and history. And I'm speaking to you from the territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam peoples. Amenu means our people in Hebrew, and it's a national, multi-generational community of progressive Jews in North America, recognizing the unbreakable bond between the Jewish people and Israel. As well as our commitment to making our society better, we mobilize Jews who seek opportunities to foster social and economic justice, both in Israel and in North America. And as Zionists, we understand that a secure peace between Israel and its neighbors is essential to the survival of the democratic Jewish state. With this in mind, we build support within the North American Jewish community for a negotiated two-state solution to the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. I'm very honored to be here today with a lot of people from across Canada. I'm very honored to be with Rabbi Dan Moskovitz from Temple Sholom in Vancouver. Dan has been the senior rabbi since 2013, and he Temple Sholom is the largest and the principal reform player and one of the main synagogues in our community here. It's been a real treat for me to host programs together with Rabbi Dan for Amenu over the past few years. And Dan's signature is very much like his approach to Torah and progressive Judaism. He has a passion for social justice and is a lot about collaboration. So I really see this as being a natural progression. I met Gilad with Dan a number of years ago. And so I'm very happy to turn this over to Dan's capable hands. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, David. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And I so admire the work that both Arts of Canada and Amenu do for progressive Judaism here and in Israel, here in Canada and Israel, and as an expression of our shared Zionism values and beliefs and hopes and dreams. It's my pleasure to spend a little bit of time now with Gilad Kariv. Gilad, you'll join us on screen in a moment, but here you are. You might recognize the room that I'm in because it's just off from the living room where you spoke to our community a few years ago. It seems like a lifetime ago before COVID. You've been out to Vancouver a few times, and every time that we have a chance to be together, whether it's in Israel or at a Reform Movement convention or program, it's always a treat and a pleasure. And one of the things that I've always admired, Gilad, about you is, well, one, your wisdom and your incredible insight into the intricacies of being a Reform Jew in Israel and really a Reform Jew in the world. Your kindness as well, and that you've always had a special place in your heart, I think, for Canada and Canadian Judaism. I know we've talked about that connection, and we feel it as well with you. So it's just a treat for us to be able to have this opportunity. So I want to start actually, Gilad, with a question, and they're starting to fly in here as we go. But I'll start with one of the two that I came with. So today is Ben Gurion Day. Zikron Livracha, and on 11th of the 14th of November. You have a special connection with Ben Gurion. If I remember one of your stories, you were born the day after he died, I think. And you're muted, Gilad. You're on mute.
I was actually born the day before he died.
The day before he died. And I know that he's always been a hero of yours. So this is not an easy question, but I'm wondering, what do you think Ben Gurion would make of, one, your ascension to the Knesset as a Reform Rabbi, and two, what would he make of what's going on between Israel and diaspora relations today? We'll get to what's going on in Israel, but what would he make of the relationship between Israel and the diaspora today, and what would he have made of it over the last 12, 13 years as well?
So first of all, Sholom and Shavua Tov, Boker Tov, and Achar Tzorayim Tovim to all of you. First, allow me to thank all of you for finding the time during the weekend to get together and to have this online conversation about the relations, our relations and the relations between Israel and the progressive communities around the world. You were right, Dan, by saying that there is a special place in my heart for the Canadian progressive Jewish community. And till COVID-19, until I was elected to the Knesset as the president of the Israeli Movement for Progressive Judaism, Toronto and Vancouver and other communities, Canadian communities, were always part of my ordinary tours to North America. And I truly believe that there is a lot in common between our two communities, and that in many ways the dialogue between the Israeli small p progressive community and the Canadian Jewish progressive community is in a way maybe the deepest dialogue between our community in Israel and the community and sister communities around the world. For many, many reasons, I celebrate the fact that this is a joint event of Artsenu and Amenu, not only because I'm today well-rooted in the two movements. Ameinu is also associated with the Israeli Labor Party, and of course I'm deeply rooted in the Israeli Reform and Progressive community, and I feel that this is a natural bond. And not only I feel that my two political and ideological families are coming together, I strongly believe that in the near future, in the coming few years, one of our major tasks is to build a strong, progressive Jewish alliance around the world, inside the national institutions and outside the national institutions. And the same way today in Israel, we are working hard in order to build the relations with the unaffiliated progressive Jews, with secular Jewish progressive organizations, with what we call the Israeli secular Jewish renewal movement. I think we need to work out in order to establish those strong relations all around the Jewish world. Now, going back to Ben Gurion. So you mentioned correctly that I have a very, how to say, a strong personal attachment to his heritage. As you mentioned, I was born a day before he died in 1973. And my great-grandfather was one of his disciples. He was appointed by Ben Gurion to establish the engineering corps of the IDF in 1948. He was a close friend and a follower of Ben Gurion. And when Ben Gurion died, he came to my mother, his daughter, and encouraged her to name me after the first prime minister and to call me David. The problem was that my other grandfather came from the other side of the political map. And he belonged to the Etzel, to one of the Irgunim, the groups that resisted Ben Gurion and his leadership before 1948. And he came and said to my mother that no way the young baby will be named after David Ben Gurion. And he demanded her to name me after his secret name in the Irgun, in the Etzel. And thank God my mother was strong enough in order to tell her father and father-in-law that I should not carry as a newly born baby the entire Zionist history on my shoulders, and that's the way I received the name Gilad, and I was saved from the name David and the name Gidon. But after escaping this political domestic battle in my family, I need to say that, like many Israelis and many Jews around the world, I totally identify Ben Gurion as one of the great leaders of the Jewish people, not only in the 20th century or in the modern history of our nation, but is one of the giants of our nation. And the main reason is that he wasn't a person of only Talmud. He was also a person of deeds. He refused to stay in the comfortable arenas of ideologies, and he always demanded an actual or concrete bottom line. And it's important to say he was a very serious ideological person. And he had very strong ideological views, basically around everything, if you read his diaries and his books. But in the end, he was one of the most pragmatic leaders of our nation, and his pragmatism enabled him in the end to reach concrete achievements. And of course, the main one was the establishment of the state of Israel, but it was only one achievement of his. And when we're talking about Ben-Gurion and his attitude towards diaspora Jewry and his attitude towards the concept of progressive Judaism, here we need to say in a very open-minded way that we should embrace some parts of his approach and ideology, while we place aside other parts of his Zionist theory. The part we need to leave aside is his strong belief that the future of the Jewish people will not only be set in Palestine or Eretz Israel, but the only way to secure the future of the Jewish people is to end diaspora life and to encourage all Jews to make Aliyah. And in that regard, I think that we are holding a more developed, a more balanced Zionist approach. And we're not judging Ben-Gurion. We need to remember that Ben-Gurion developed its attitude in a different world, especially after the Holocaust. He was all occupied by the need to bring more Jews, to strengthen the sovereign presence of our nation in Palestine and then in Medinat Israel. It's not about judging his theory. It's about understanding that we have today the ability, when half of the Jews around the world live in Israel, we have the ability to move into a more mature Zionist era that identifies blessing in the fact that we have a very strong Jewish center in Medinat Israel, but at the same time, we have flourishing communities around the world. And yes, Ben-Gurion was right by saying that without Medinat Israel, it will be extremely difficult to secure the future of the Jewish people and the future of Judaism. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that Jewish life overseas doesn't carry an independent value. And in that regard, I think that progressive is suggesting a more mature approach to this element of Ben-Gurion theory. The part that we need to take from his philosophy is the understanding that if we want to promote our status, our agenda, our values in Israel, we need to commit ourselves to the public, political, communal, educational effort. We need to be strong. We need to be fully active in promoting our agenda. No one is going to do for us our holy work. And at the same time, we need also to be pragmatic. We need to understand that things are not being created overnight. This is one of Ben-Gurion's most important teaching. May 15th, 1948 was a great day in the history of the Jewish people. But it was a great day only because for 60 years, Jews in Palestine and around the world prepared themselves for this magnificent moment of independence. And Ben-Gurion taught us that in the end, if we want to create great moments and great revolutions, we need to work very hard to set facts on ground. And this is a lesson that we all need to take. I will even suggest, and I'll end with that, that our ideological and political community, both in Israel and around the Jewish world, forgot this important lesson, that in the end, it's all about setting facts on ground. It's all about doing concrete things that will shape the reality with full commitment to our ideology, but also with a very pragmatic approach of how to implement it.
Thank you, Gilad. Just going to add my spotlight there. Wow, there's a lot to unpack in what you've just said, and there's a lot of questions coming in. I'm trying to pull many of them together into this next one, which I had come in with also. So let me see if I can build on what you've said. You talked about pragmatism, and I'm really curious to know, but this isn't the only part of the question, how you manage that pragmatism as the only Reform Rabbi in the Knesset and one of a handful of progressive Reform Jews, liberal Jews in the Knesset, and in a coalition that is, new and fragile and coming out of this experience of Netanyahu and his governments and with the ultra-Orthodox, they're still there. They're still very, very present in, the kind of divided government that growing up as an American, I'm very familiar with now as I look to the States. So one is the pragmatism of that approach, but I want to add a layer to that question, which is that you talked about patience, and we hear that a lot, but I know that for many in my congregation, I think across Canada, the growing frustration with an ongoing occupation and an ongoing, and I would say even a deteriorating, one can deteriorate even more, relationship with both Palestinians and Israelis, and Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. And we see the conflict taking place now inside the Green Line, within neighborhoods and communities. And certainly we see things that are going on in our name, beyond the Green Line, that have created a great division and divide now within our Jewish communities here. And we know that's been going on for a long time. But I'm seeing people move away. I'm seeing people move away from Israel as part of their connection, certainly young people, but not only young. And I'll just add to this rather complicated question that I'm trying to get to, which is that, when Israel acts, it acts in our name as Jews, and we carry that in the public space here in Canada, and we carry that in the internet and all of those other public spaces. But when the diaspora tries to establish its values, it's often dismissed by Israeli society, by the Israeli government. It has been for a number of years, as well, you don't live here, your children are not on the front lines, all of those things we've heard before. So how do you approach, and what do you think is the magic sauce in trying to bring these long-held Reform progressive values to the discussion about the really hard things? And now as we see the growing divide of conflict that is taking place within Israeli society, between Jews and Jews, between Jews and Arab Israelis, between Palestinians and Israelis. What is your approach as one of those lone voices in the halls of power?
So thank you, Dan, for that. I think you brought together a few very important questions. They're all connected, but we need to address them from a few perspectives. I'll start by saying, and I'm not going to develop this topic. I think that in my many visits to Canada, to the Canadian Reform congregations, I shared my views about that as a Reform Rabbi. But I do want to say at the beginning of my answer that in the end, even if we see Zionism and our relations with Israel, or the relations between Israel and diaspora Jews, as a key component of our Jewish identity, we need always to remember that we cannot base the Jewish identity of the next generation of Jews only about the national elements of our collective existence. Now, I'm saying it carefully because I am a very devoted Zionist. I love my country. I think that Ben Gurion was right by saying that without a sovereign existence, it will be extremely difficult to secure the future of the Jewish people. But at the same time, as a Reform Rabbi, I think that both in Israel and overseas, we need to understand that by definition, not because of the occupation, by definition, when the younger generation of Jews didn't experience 1948 and 1967 and 1973, and many of them don't even remember the fight for Soviet Jewry. Right? They missed all the great moments of Jewish nationalism of the 20th century. If we understand that this is the case with the younger generation of Jews, we need to understand that unless we create a deeper and a wider, either cultural or communal theological base for their Jewish identity, we will lose them. And in a way, it's not our generation, because here in this conversation we have more than one generation, but we need to understand that maybe for the generation of my grandparents, parents, and my generation, the fight for Jewish sovereignty in Palestine, Eretz Israel, was so strong that it filled our entire Jewish identity. This is not the case with the younger generation of Jews. It's also the case in Israel, not only in the diaspora communities. And we need first to find ways to make Judaism relevant to their individual and communal life. And only then we can build this second floor of Jewish peoplehood, Jewish nationalism, and engagement with Israel. And in that regard, I think that, especially in the Reform movement, and looking carefully into this shift from towards Jewish peoplehood and nationalism that occurred during the 20th century, we need to understand that for a few decades, Jewish peoplehood was the entering path to serious Judaism, and we need to rebalance it today. Again, not because of the occupation, because this is a natural development. And Judaism and Zionism of the 21st century will not be similar to Judaism and Zionism of the 20th century. And we need to embrace this understanding and not to be terrified by the fact that the younger generation of our communities, again, both in Israel and overseas, is asking more questions. It's a natural development. And we need to find a way to give them the feeling that Judaism, again, is relevant to their life in a way that they can allow themselves to ask questions about Jewish nationalism without disconnecting themselves from the Jewish community. Now moving to the other part of the question. Look, when I spoke about finding a way to hold our ideology on one hand, and at the same time, in the other hand, to hold a pragmatic approach towards politics, I refer to what you raised in the question then. We need to understand that the map of challenges that we face today in Israel is not 100% similar to the map of challenges we had during the 80s and the 90s of the 20th century. Occupation is still a huge threat to the future of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. We are not allowed to close our eyes. We need to work out to promote a two-state solution. But at the same time, we need also to realize that we are called today to deal with more existential threats. And I will mention two. One is the growing polarization of our society. And in that regard, the new government should not be seen only as a political necessity. The fact that unfortunately the central left doesn't have today the majority to form a government and we need this wide unity government. Yes, it's a political necessity, but it is also an opportunity. The Netanyahu term or Netanyahu's term created many obstacles to the implementation of a two-state solution. But at the same time, it also caused a deep rift in the Israeli society. And without healing this open wound inside our society, and inside, the Jewish world, it will be extremely, extremely difficult to move forward towards courageous decisions in Israel in regard to the territories. I strongly believe that in order to revive the ability of the Israeli society to take brave decisions about the future relations with the Palestinians, we need this era of healing the domestic internal wounds that were created by the former governments. Now, it doesn't mean that we should allow ourselves not to deal with the situation in the territories, but it means that we need to understand that we are not allowed only to hold our pure ideologies in regard to the relations with the Palestinians. We also need to think how we stabilize the Israeli society so we will be able to move towards a more stable solution with the Palestinians. And I know that many people are concerned with the fact that the new government is planning to build in the existing settlements. But this is the time to remind people that the former government talked about annexation, and that the former government talked about legalizing all the outputs. And this government is not following this discourse. And this government is also talking about building or developing Palestinian communities inside what we call the sea territories. This government is not going to implement a two-state solution, but this government is also not going to push an annexation plan. And again, we need to understand that this is the meaning of not giving up your ideology, but also being pragmatic. And what we need to say to the younger generation, we need to remind our younger partners inside our communities what was the reality in Israel 6 months ago and what is the reality today. The issue with the Israeli Arabs is an extremely important example. Yes, unfortunately, after years of neglecting the growing tension between Jews and Arabs inside the Green Line, and we saw it 6 months ago in what happened with what happened in the mixed cities. Right now, the Israeli government, for the first time in the history of Israel, includes a non-Zionist Arabic party. And more important, this government just approved an unprecedented multi-year national plan to close gaps between Jews and Arabs, with an investment of 32 billion new Israeli shekels in 5 years. And I'm saying it because, yes, we face a huge challenge with Israeli Arabs, but this government is the first one to offer solutions. We are not able to implement all our plans. I'm the head of the Knesset Constitutional Committee. Unfortunately, it's not easy to rewrite what we call the nation-state basic legislation, but we need to try to improve it. And at the same time, we need to close the gaps. And again, this is the government that is doing it, and a government that offers a new understanding of political partnership between Jews and Arabs in Israel. And this is our task as leaders and as activists, to tell our communities, yes, we need to stick to our ideology, but Israel is not a theoretical place. Israel is not something we teach in supplementary schools and as a Jewish ideal. This is a real place, a real country with many challenges. They will not be solved overnight, but we need to ask ourselves, what is the general direction? And the general direction of the government today in most fields is a positive direction. I saw that one of you raised the question about those 6 civil society Palestinian organizations that were banned by the Israeli government or by the defense minister Benny Gantz. It's okay to criticize his decision, but at the same time, we need to remember that he was the leading minister that went to see Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, and to renew the direct relations with the Palestinian Authority. And we need to be able to share those pieces of information with our crowds if we want a more balanced approach to what is happening in Israel.
Thank you, Gilad. Thank you. I'm going to turn to other questions. I could just keep going, but I'm going to turn to the questions of those that have submitted here. And I want to start with Karen Mock, who's the president of JSpace Canada. And she writes that she thanks you for your kind words about Canadian progressive Zionist community and agrees that with you completely on the next generation, but wants you to advise on some practical strategies that we might use to strengthen and to enhance the leadership of that next generation, particularly on campus. And I see this in my community, as I'm sure many of my colleagues do as well, without denigrating Zionism. And at the same time, speaking of our human rights and reform and Jewish social justice values. So I guess if I can summarize a little bit, if you get the question, and David and Lee agree to ask this as well, that so my university students are impatient. They see, I love what you're saying, but they say, show me the progress, show me how Israel today, even with its new government 6 months old, is reflective of the values that I was raised with in my, by my rabbi in my synagogue, at my bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, whatever it is. And I'm getting assaulted on campus by all of these groups that associate Zionism with the most horrible atrocities in history. What do you say to those young Reform leaders on campus, those young Reform Jews who are looking to try to bridge this divide?
Look, first, I think we need, and I think that we are doing it. I think that the progressive rabbinate and the progressive communal and educational leadership are doing it for many years now, but it's still important to say we first need to be honest. We need to be honest, we need to be sophisticated, we need to embrace the questions, the doubts, and the criticism. We all know that the next generation, I experience it with my teenagers. We all know that the next generation or the younger generation are much more sophisticated than us. And in that regard, it's extremely difficult to raise open-minded, inclusive, progressive human beings and ask them not to ask questions when it comes to Zionism. And yes, Israel is dealing with existential and moral challenges, and we should not escape this fact. The occupation is real. the occupation in Israel, and unfortunately, half of the Israeli society is not troubled by this reality, and we need to say, yes, this is the situation. At the same time, we need to make sure as leaders that our younger generation is being exposed to the complexity of the Israeli reality and also to its positive elements. And I'm not referring to the fact that Israel is an high-tech nation and that we brought the cherry tomatoes to the entire world. I leave this kind of Israeli aspara to others. As leaders, as activists, we need to expose our younger generation and our crowds in general to the complexity of things in Israel, but also to the positive elements. It is our duty to tell people that the current government in Israel is the first government that includes a non-Zionist Arab party. It is our duty to share with them that, yes, there are big gaps between Jews and Arabs in Israel, but today there is a national plan and a serious public investment in closing the gaps. Yes, we need to tell people that, unfortunately, this government doesn't have the ability to implement a two-state solution right now, but that this government placed aside any idea or any plan of annexation. We need to do it. We need to share those facts with them. We need to share with Israelis and diaspora progressive Jews what are the things that we are starting to achieve in this government, and what are the things that will probably have to wait to a next to a more progressive government in the future. And most important, we need to share with our younger generation the deep feeling that, again, going back to Ben-Gurion's teaching, in order to create a better future, we need to invest in concrete actions. And what we need to tell our younger generation, that yes, when half of the Jews around the world live in Israel, unfortunately, they will be challenged in the campuses with what Israel is doing if they identify themselves as Jews and as lovers of Israel. And the only way to create a better reality in Israel and in diaspora communities is to be active in pushing the right agenda, both in Israel and around the Jewish world. And that this is the only way to move forward. That disengaging themselves from Zionism, from Israel, from Judaism, is not going to solve anything. That there is a real potential to create a change today in Israel and in the Jewish world. There are many Israeli partners that are looking forward to work with them, to believe with them, to be engaged with them in order to create a better reality. And in that regard, I'll add one short thought. I think that what we learned from 4 years of President Trump in your southern neighbor is that some of the phenomena we see today in Israel do not belong only to the Jewish state. We live in a very complicated democratic era. In that regard, I think that the Canadian situation is much better than other parts in Europe and, of course, in the US. But you all know that the world is a small little village. And in that regard, progressive values, progressive democracies, a progressive way of life, on the one hand, is leading the way in many societies. But as you all know, there are mighty forces that are working against our progressive, liberal, democratic achievements. And when you look today what is happening in Israel in regard to racial violence or racial challenges in the Israeli society, they are deeply connected to things that you see today in Central and Western Europe and to things we saw in the US till recently. And if we share with the younger generation, this is not only about Israel. It's either the progressive Jewish forces and the progressive general forces work together to create a better environment and reality in Israel, in Europe, in Canada, in the US. Unless we work together, things that are troubling us today in regard to Israel, in the end, we will see them in Europe or the US or other parts of the world. And to understand that this is a global battle for progressive values, this is a notion that we need to root in the minds and the hearts of our younger generation.
Thank you, Gilad. Thank you. We only have about 10 minutes left. I've asked 3 questions. It's a very typical conversation between you and I. But I want to turn to Orthodoxy for a moment. We have a few questions about it. You released a really informative video in Hebrew earlier this week, I think it was, about the self-appointed rabbi of the Kotel and what is going on there and his prevention of access to Reform and conservative Jews. We know about the Kotel agreement that was shelved and hopefully is coming back, and we know the tensions about that. And also, you're this unicorn, right? You're this Reform rabbi in the Knesset, surrounded by, though they're in the minority party, most of them, not all of them, ultra-Orthodox Jews, rabbis who don't recognize your legitimacy as a rabbi and, question it on probably all sorts of other levels too. What's going to happen with the Kotel? What is it like working with the colleagues? We see the headlines. Is there something behind the scenes that we're not seeing where, God willing, there's some kesher, there's some connection between you and your rabbinic colleagues there? Can you lift the veil a little bit and show us what's going on?
So first of all, like always, there is what you see in the television or in the websites, and there is the daily reality. And indeed, some of those very or extremely vocal ultra-Orthodox Knesset members that attack us on a daily basis, at the same time, they work with me or with us behind the scenes. But it is true that the current level of incitement and the current level of delegitimizing us as a religious community, the levels are in many ways unprecedented, and it has to do with the fact, and it's not a personal achievement of mine, the fact that today Reform and conservative Judaism are much more present in the Israeli Knesset, in the Israeli municipalities, in the public arena. And unfortunately, the fact that the current government or the current coalition brings together modern Orthodox parties, and the Israeli Prime Minister right now is a modern Orthodox Jew, Naftali Bennett, the fact that modern Orthodox parties sit in the same coalition with one of the leaders of the Israeli Reform movement, this is one of the main weapons that the ultra-Orthodox parties are using in order to attack the current government and the current prime minister and the current coalition. We need to see the current government as a real window of opportunity for us to set facts on ground. One of them is the Kotel. And we are working very hard in recent weeks to bring back the issue of the Kotel agreement to the center of the public agenda and the agenda of the government. Here again, we will have to be pragmatic. We will have to understand that maybe not all parts of the agreement can be fully implemented, but we need to achieve something. Going back to Ben-Gurion, there were those who said, don't declare the birth of the state of Israel because we are getting only half of the country. And he said, no, we are beginning with what we can achieve. And this is the approach we need to adopt in regard to the Kotel. We need to use this moment in order to have some significant progress around the issue of the wall, and I strongly believe it will happen in the coming few months. At the same time, we need to remember that the Kotel is not the only goal of ours. For the first time, the Israeli national budget includes financial support for pluralistic causes, for the two non-Orthodox movements, for secular Jewish organizations and communities. We need to work out in order to promote other issues of religion and state. By definition, we're not going to achieve everything. By definition, it will be step by step, but the direction is a positive one. Is a positive one, and we need to, in a way, to give less attention to the ultra-Orthodox incitement. They are now in the opposition. And the main question is not what I will say in reaction to their incitement. The main question is what concrete achievements we can achieve with this government in the general arena of religion and state relations, and with the particular need to secure some government support for our causes, values, and activities. And I think that we are already starting to achieve concrete achievements in that regard.
Thank you, Gilad. I've got time for one more short question. Well, short answer. The question is whatever it is. And then we're going to turn it over to wrap up. But, and you know, look, we've all become armchair epidemiologists over these last 2 years. We don't know. None of us can plan. I say to my staff, I can't plan more than 3 weeks in advance. But our community here in Vancouver is planning a trip to Israel with all four actually of the major congregations in the community in late July, early August. I have many families and congregants across Canada that want to go back to Israel. Will Israel be open? Well, I can only imagine Israel without tour buses going around it right now today. Yeah. What's the projection on opening back up?
Look, first of all, I need to say that in a very strange way, I became to be the leading Knesset member in the COVID-19 arena, because my committee is responsible for all the COVID-19 legislation and regulations in Israel. So I deal daily with this question. And in that regard, I have positive news. I strongly believe that Israel will open the sky again. I think that we are waiting for other countries around the world to move forward with the booster vaccination plan, and it will happen in the coming few weeks or months. You know, Israel is ahead a few months before other countries in the Western world in the vaccination programs. But the current government, and again, one of the differences between the former government and the current government is that the current government insists to revive to revive a routine, the routine of our life, and to find a way to live aside COVID-19 and to adopt a much more moderate approach to the way we deal with this pandemic. So in that regard, yes, please start to plan your visits to Israel. We don't know, we can all be surprised by the developments of the pandemic, but I think that with the vaccination abilities that we have today in the Western world, it's time to replan the visits to Israel. It's time to bring Israeli speakers back to your communities. It's time to continue to use Zoom technology and web technology in order to have a dialogue. And in that regard, I'm quite optimistic.
As my mother would say, from your mouth to God's ears. And if I can get to Israel, hopefully we can grab a drink. Gilad, this has been such a pleasure to spend some time with you. And for all of those that have joined us here, I hope that they found it to be as informative and inspiring, truly, and as honest as I have. It's my privilege now to turn it over to Penny Fine to help us wrap up. Thank you, Gilad, for this time in I know what is a very busy time for you. Thank you. Penny?
Thank you.
Gilad, toda rabba. We are truly honored that you have shared your precious time and your wisdom with us, and you've given us so much to absorb, so many challenges to meet. And I just wanted to make a couple of points, and one of them, when you mentioned the fact of establishing facts on the ground, what so impressed me when you were the leader of the IMPJ, the Israel Movement for Progressive and Reform Judaism, that you inspired us with the vision of creating communities in Israel from the bottom up, listening to what these communities had to say and establishing progressive Judaism around the country. It was a massive undertaking, and it's going to make a huge difference in the next generation of Israelis. And frankly, I think in the next generation of diaspora Jews who will be engaging with these Israelis. I really wanted to give you kol hakavod for that, because it certainly inspired us. And the other, you talked about partnerships, and I know I don't have very much time, but I just wanted to say how delighted I am that Reform Judaism under APPA and a more secular, the labor Zionists, Menu, have come together. I think this is critical, absolutely critical. And again, you give us the inspiration to move forward, to have a dream, but also to pragmatically deal with the realities and the 21st century challenges, and the fact of that we don't share this and shared narratives. We talk about it, we throw that term around. We don't have a shared narrative necessarily about Israel with the generations that are coming up, and we have to help to build that and make it a strong one. So yes, and we have planned to be in Israel in February, so hopefully we will see you then. We thank you for the many people that have tuned into this. We would very, very much like to get your feedback, as well as any other topics and speakers you would like to see, because we will continue this partnership between APPA Canada and Amenu Canada, and hope to bring you more interesting and provocative and challenging sessions like this one. You will be receiving an email, everyone that has participated. We will ask for your feedback, and again, for the speakers and topics. You'll also have a link to this session, which has been recorded. Please share it over your various networks. And with all of this wonderful technology that we are now getting, I guess, a little bit tired of, but it's changed our lives, please spread the word, because these are important messages. Gilad, you continue to be an inspiration, and you continue to challenge us. And we hope that you have success with all that you're trying to achieve, and look forward to seeing you in Israel as soon as we can.
Thank you, everybody. Gilad, again, thank you. I guess it's late there, so we're going to wish you a Laila Tov. To all of you who joined us online, and to Casey Soar, who is behind the scenes helping get everybody on screen at the right time. We thank you for participating in this. Watch your inbox for that email later today or tomorrow, and have a wonderful, wonderful day and a week. Shavua Tov.